Hello and welcome. I'm Crystal Rowe, Senior Editor at BuzzFeed, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the Two-Sentence Horror Stories panel brought to you by Stage 13, a division of Warner Brothers. Today, we will be talking with some wonderful and talented panelists who are storytellers from diverse backgrounds, reinventing the horror genre with their groundbreaking work in two-sentence horror stories. Now, before we get into it, for our visually impaired guests, I'll be asking the panel members to include physical descriptions of themselves during each of their introductions. And I'll start with myself. As I said, I'm Crystal. I'm an Asian woman, I have black hair, and I'm wearing a black shirt. So let's get into it. Let's start with Vera Meow. She is the creator and executive producer of Two-Sentence Horror Stories. She's written for shows like AMC's Fear the Walking Dead, the upcoming Amazon series The Expatriates, and she's developing her next feature with T Street and A Major Media. Hello and welcome, Vera.
Hi, I'm Vera. I'm an Asian woman with bleached blonde hair, wearing a white t-shirt and black glasses.
Excellent. Thanks, Vera. Next, we have Kimani Ray Smith. He's the director of Season 2's Bagman and Manifest Destiny. Initially breaking into the industry as a stunt performer, Smith worked on films such as iRobot, Salt, The A-Team, Twilight, Total Recall, and Deadpool. He's also second unit directed on series like Olympus, Van Helsing, Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency, and Netflix's Wu Assassins. And he's directed on Van Helsing for Sci-Fi. Hello and welcome, Kimani.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kimani Ray Smith, and I identify as a African American, a bit of a mashup. I have Cherokee, Irish, Welsh in me as well. I have black with salt and pepper hair, and I'm wearing a gray shirt, jean shirt.
Excellent. Thanks, Kimani. Next, we have Chase Joynt. He is the director of Season 2's Elliot. Joynt's films have won jury and audience awards internationally, and he most recently co-directed the documentary No Ordinary Man, which was in competition at 2020's Toronto Film Festival. Joynt is also the co-author of You Only Live Twice, which was a 2017 Lambda Literary Award finalist and named one of the best books of the year by The Globe, Mail, and CBC. Hello and welcome, Chase.
Thanks so much for having me. My name is Chase. I'm a white trans-masculine person with full sleeve tattoos and a denim jacket.
Excellent. Thanks, Chase. Next, we have Melody Cooper. She is the writer of Season 2's Quota and Ibeji. Cooper is currently a fellow in the Sundance Episodic Lab and a former HBO Access Writing Fellow. She's an award-winning playwright, comic book author, and has written for shows like Law & Order SVU and Greg Grunberg's The Insiders. She's also developing a horror feature with Fearworks. Hello and welcome.
Hi, I'm Melody Cooper. I'm a black woman with red glasses, a black top, and I have big wavy hair.
Excellent. Thanks, Melody. And finally, we have Elaine Chin. She is the Senior Vice President of Scripted Content for Stage 13, the studio behind Two-Sentence Horror Stories. Hello and welcome, Elaine.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Elaine Chin. I'm an Asian woman, black hair, and gray sweater.
Thanks, everyone. So let's get into the show. Inspired by viral fan fiction, Two-Sentence Horror Stories is a critically acclaimed psychological horror anthology series featuring a different subgenre of horror in each episode. Designed to subvert classic horror tropes by centering everyday people and diverse perspectives, the half-hour series taps into universal primal fears while tackling provocative social and cultural issues within our modern society. Season 2 is currently airing on the CW, so let's take a look at the trailer. All right, so my first question is for Vera. As the creator of Two-Sentence Horror Stories, take us back to the beginning. Where did the idea even come from?
Back to the beginning would be, I believe, 2014. I came into the Stage 13 office pitch, which I didn't actually think was going to mean anything. I just thought it would be good practice. And they just asked me about the ideas that I had bouncing around in my brain, and this was just one of them. It just had this idea about essentially refreshing a kind of Twilight Zone approach to episodic horror, but updating it for, sort of the folks and the issues and the context of today. And that was essentially what I pitched them. I'd also thought about in the context of two-sentence horror stories themselves, which was a phenomenon that started on Reddit. When someone in the Reddit community posed a challenge, can you write a horror story in 2 sentences? Which is actually a really hard literary device, frankly. And so many folks responded, and a bunch of the best ones went viral. And just as a horror fan, it had crossed my path, and I thought they were really cool. And I found that with the best ones, I would start imagining whole scenarios based on this provocative, very brief story. And that really combined with this desire to go into, sort of like the beloved space of episodic anthology horror. Those two together were really the core inspirations behind the idea.
Nice. And Elaine, being on the scripted side of Stage 13, I assume you were there in the room when it happened, when it was pitched to you. What was it about
I
the
wish I
concept of the
was,
series?
actually, full disclosure.
No? Okay. No, that's fair. When did you get
Full
involved in the
disclosure, I'm
process?
actually newer to the company, but what I can speak to is that, Christina Double, actually, who's a Sundance alumna on the programming side, actually had connected with Vera and, had heard the pitch. And I think at the time, Stage 13 was a sort of digital first, division within WarnerMedia. And the focus was to find opportunities to seed and produce short form content. And so this like perfectly sort of in that bucket on all sides. It was both in terms of a really great idea, entertaining in terms of sort of a genre's perspective, but also told very much from a point of view that hadn't been seen before. And Vera, is the sort of total package in terms of somebody who loves the genre, but also has a really sophisticated, layered point of view in it that also centers people who have been underrepresented, I think, particularly in this genre in general in media. So this all fulfilled so many of the mission statements, I think, for the company. And it's grown tremendously since then. So we're really thrilled about that. But that was sort of the birthplace, was at that point.
Got it. So Vera, I've read that for you, the series is first and foremost a love letter to the horror genre. And I'd love to hear you talk about that and maybe tell us some of your own personal horror inspirations for the series and maybe your work outside the series in general.
Yeah, I mean, I am a horror nerd from being a tiny child that probably it was inappropriate to be able to watch the stuff that I watched, but that's what happens when you're a child of immigrants and a kid. So I think in terms of the books that I read, the comics that I read, the TV shows I watched, the movies that I watched, horror, sci-fi, fantasy, kung fu, action, all of that has been front and center. So, I've always wanted to tell stories in this genre. And aside from, sort of childhood nostalgia and love for the genre, I really do actually believe that horror, particularly psychological horror, has the capacity and the potential to really give us, and I say us people, the license and the permission to be able to go in a different way into some of our deepest fears, and to go into the dread that we feel in, at least for me personally, in a way that sometimes just a straight drama is actually quite hard for me to take. It's a little too close to the actual subject matter, and maybe in a funny way I'm so sensitive that that closeness and that reality is actually, it's hard for me to consume. So horror has always given me this license to be able to go into those deeper fears that I'm fascinated by, but clearly a little bit of a chicken to engage straightforward. So yeah, I mean, I have an endless list of favorites and influences, what have you. A lot of the influences, I also think that we're currently in this moment in the last few years, especially where we have a renaissance of, I hesitate to use qualifying words, but I just think we're in a renaissance of really layered, emotionally complex, big idea horror. That is really exciting for me. So while a lot of my favorites and some of the early influences for the series, like I said, are the Twilight Zones or the Rosemary's Baby, really some of like canonical horror films, particularly from the 70s. The series has really grown to encompass all of the incredible horror that's been made throughout, and also quite recently. And just personal favorites for me are, Let the Right One In. Hereditary is just taken up so much in that top tier of influences that I return to again and again. And with all of those, you can see the thematics around loneliness, around belonging, around family, around community and connection. And those are really the thematics I think that drive two-sentence horror stories. So I'm a horror nerd across the board. And the feature film that I've written and working with Ryan Johnson's T Street Productions and A Major Media to make is also a horror film, but I'll just say that it's probably not what people are used to when they think of horror. And so it's very much a passion of mine. And I think that there's a lot of creative and fantastical flexibility in the genre to really get smart and to get provocative and to get interesting, and also to build really complex characters. And then the last thing I'll say, and then I'll shut up, is, throughout the history of horror, right, horror has been used, and there's so much, sort of conversation about how horror is used as metaphor and allegory, for the sort of social fears that exist. And so with this series, with two-sentence horror stories, we're centering the folks who are typically not centered on the screen, right? So that is people of color, that is queer folks, that's trans and gender non-binary folks, right? And when we do that, horror becomes this incredible, elastic, and really appropriate tool with which to talk about fears. And I think that our fears look a little different. And some of them encompass monsters as metaphors and villains, of course. And then it also has to include what I call the true villains, the real monsters. And a lot of times you'll see in the stories that they exist side by side.
I love that. I think you've hit the nail on the head about there being sort of this renaissance right now, especially in feature films with, sort of smart horror. Like obviously there's like Get Out or something like His House, The Invisible Man. There's been so much just in the last couple of years that are really knocking it apart, which is why I think partially why this show is so timely and interesting that it's sort of happening all around that. Kimani and Chase and Melody, how about you guys? What are some of your horror influences, which I'm sure you have when it came to doing your pieces?
Well, definitely J-horror and Korean horror. I love Korean films and Japanese films, Asian films in general, just because I do have a stunt background and a lot of my beginnings were into Chinese Kung Fu and shows like that. But yeah, for Bagman, we kind of did go lean into the J-horror and try to, just that entity kind of vibe, the presence of something that's dangerous and mysterious. But again, with Bagman, it was a little bit of a mashup. Like we did have like that kind of Breakfast Club feel to it, a group of kids in detention being, confined with a threat. So yeah, it was a fun episode to work on. Thank you.
Yeah,
Vera.
I love that you literally had another character named Bender too. I'm like, what a mashup! J-horror and Breakfast Club is amazing.
Yeah.
Chase, how about you? What are some of your horror influences?
I have to start by admitting that as a trans person, I've spent much of my life being very horror adverse. And, part of that is wrapped up in the history of trans bodies in horror being scapegoats and placeholders and dumping grounds for, broader socio-political anxieties. And, watching Jordan Peele's Get Out, was kind of a transformative moment for me, but even more so actually reading about the film and reading script notes and reading about how he was thinking aloud between the relationship between horror and documentary felt to me like a turning point in thinking about genre as tool. And I borrowed some of that inspiration in developing the point of view for Elliot, which was to say, what if we treat this like a documentary and then put pressure in different places and see what can happen with that kind of a sort of a nonfiction commitment in a scripted space?
And that's interesting because you have a nonfiction background, so that's like sort of the perfect blend of the ideas. Melody, how about you? Horror influences?
Well, like Vera, I was weaned on sci-fi and horror, so I grew up with that from a very young age, and I'm a very social issues driven writer. So I like the idea of Trojan horsing these, dealing with those issues through horror, and to what you were saying, Vera, about not being able to deal with horror and those issues face on, but in horror you're able to examine it. I kind of grew up feeling the same way. So I like Pan's Labyrinth. Spanish horror for me really speaks to the ways in which you can kind of dive into societal issues, but use it through horror. Get Out is obviously more recently, but The Invitation, The Babadook. All those movies, even People Under the Stairs, it's like an extreme, but it's just such a great way of dealing with class and race. And then for the work that I did for Two Sentence Horror Stories, like the granddaddy of them all, The Night of the Living Dead, and even that, and if you remember The Final Moments, deals with a societal kind of viewpoint on horror. So I think horror has such a great potential to do that. That's why I love working in on the show in particular, and just in general in the genre.
I'm so glad you mentioned Night of the Living Dead. That's the exact vibe I got from Quota. So I'm like, cool, I got it. Okay. Vera, I'm going back to you. Let's talk about the importance of centering underrepresented voices. Did you make conscious decisions when it came to inclusion across the board for BI, POC, and LGBTQ crew, both above and below the line?
Yes. I mean, I think, yes. I think this is a time, right? Like, we're in this moment in time in which at least there's quite a theater and a performance around having a conversation around diversity and inclusion. And, I understand the question and I understand what makes this show notable. So I want to speak to that because yes, it was 100% the intention. It was also in the pitch. Like that was core to the pitch of the show. So it's engaged into the DNA of the show from the beginning. But this was about, putting people of color and queer folks and trans folks in front of them behind the camera. Having said that, I do also want to just say it also, while it was deeply intentional and incredibly thought out, and I had to be deliberate about it because frankly in this industry too, it is also just me. It is me. It is the world that I know. It is the people in my life. It is the point of view that I hold. And so in actuality, as a storyteller, for me not to do that would actually be to adopt a less specific, less personal point of view. So, I think that there is just something to be said about both the intentionality and the sort of noteworthiness of it, because it is true. And that was baked in on my side from the beginning because I was aware of the context. And also that it's also just like a simple truth. When you center folks and give them the ability to make decisions and to shape the story, they are going to ideally, if you're a personal storyteller, and everyone on this panel really deeply believes in the power of personal storytelling, I just created the space to say who you are informs and drives the story. And, and there's not much more of a magic formula beyond that.
Love that. Let's pivot a little bit and talk about the writing for the series. Vera, you wrote all the episodes in the original digital series. I think you wrote a couple of the episodes in season 1, and you wrote the first episode this season. Just one question. Are you the one who's coming up with all the two-sentence horror concepts and ideas, or is there like other writers contributing to that?
Well, yeah, so the first digital season, there was no writer's room. It was just me. So I wrote all of the scripts. And then the first CW season was the first time that I had a chance to put together a writer's room. So from then on, all of the seasons have really benefited from a writer's room where, folks who are super talented come together and, we pitch a bunch of ideas and and break story together like every other show, in the traditional television sense. I think with this show, it is clearly like it's an ideas factory because it is an episodic anthology series, and also as more seasons, as we rack more seasons, we can't duplicate themes or images or and so I think I created a little bit of its own monster. But yeah, always a writer's room, and since the first season on CW that's on Netflix now, it's always been a collective effort to generate ideas and to break them and to turn them into the things that we see on screen.
Got it. So is it sort of like come up with the two-sentence horror stories in the room and then work a script from there, or is it more of a concept, reverse engineer the two-sentence horror story, or how is it generally working in the writer's room? Maybe Melody, you could speak to that a little.
I always say I'm point agnostic. I think the first season when I wrote myself, there was some of the stories were actually driven by a two-sentence horror story. But Melody can speak to the, it's agonizing to come up with these, and to be perfectly frank, I think we fall into like you create the story and the script and then you reverse engineer.
Yeah, we pretty much did a lot of that, and then you're constantly throwing ideas up. You're trying to generate new ideas and interesting ideas that have to do with all kinds of from a different point of view. And if we were governed by the two sentences, it would have limited us. So we just kind of blue skied a lot of ideas. I think I have 4 volumes of ideas, notebooks with ideas, and so reverse engineering just gave us more freedom to develop different stories, I think.
And I know you guys are working on a season 3 currently. Are there any like subgenres you're hoping to tackle that you haven't so far?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's early days, so who's to say what are the stories that ultimately settle down. So and of course I'm always we can always return to subgenres that we've already played with. So, but I hope that the season 3 includes, I love vampires and werewolves, and that hasn't made its way into our universe as of yet. I'm always a fan of sci-fi horror. It's very hard to achieve, and also on the sort of like budget and production scale that we operate under as an ambitious but modest show. So it's always that back and forth. Demon possession always comes into play. Always madness is always seems to be recurring.
Good old demon possession.
Yeah, I mean, I think you think about possession and madness, and look at 2020, 2021, and you could probably understand why it keeps recurring.
All our lives right now.
Evergreen subgenres. So,
yeah, right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Excellent. All right. Well, talking about production, let's talk to our directors. Kimani, I want to talk about your first episode 1, Bagman. As you mentioned earlier, blending a little bit of Breakfast Club, a little bit of J horror. I detected some great visual nods to the Twilight Zone. Correct me if I'm wrong. In your opening shots with like the eyeballs and like the mannequin and the clock, which for me was like setting the tone for the season. What is it like? All that aside, what's it like working on sort of like a smaller, it seemed like everything was contained to like one location, which a lot of the episodes seem to be, which is really impressive that you guys are able to tell the stories that you do in such a small amount of time and a location. Can you speak to that a little?
Yeah. First going into it, it gets to shoot, actors in a room, in a box. This is going to be easy. Yeah, no problems. Little did I know that it was quite challenging, and especially with the subject matter. It was very sensitive, and we have 5 to 6 characters in a small room with 15 to 20 crew jammed in, coming in and out. So with having like the short schedule and the a lot of content to get across, it was quite challenging. But all in all, everyone on the production brought their A game. There was such a passion for every individual on the set. Everyone had it felt like, I don't know. I've worked on bigger films and bigger productions, but the thing I loved about it had this indie family vibe. Everyone got along. Everyone helped each other out. Everyone, contributed in their own departments, but also lent a helping hand to other departments when they needed it. So I think there was a real family affair, and it was set up beautifully by Liz Levine and Sean, the producers up in Vancouver. They really got together a great crew, a great set of individuals just to create this. And everyone had that passion, that burning desire to put out the best product.
Yeah, it turned out great. I have a question about the Bagman. What or who does he represent, at least in your mind? And what was up with the Norse? What I thought looked like Norse writing on his head. If it needs to remain a mystery, that's fine. I'm just curious.
Well, the Bagman is a bit of a mystery. Let's put it that way. But yeah, he's kind of, I guess, in my opinion, he represents like the system. He's a system that's put in place, and he's not necessarily there for the safety and well-being of everyone. The system that's been put in place it has its own agenda, and that agenda is its own, and hopefully we'll be able to discover a little bit more about Bagman, because he is such a great character, and our actor did such a great job.
He's great.
But yeah, it's and to talk about the runes, yes, they are Nordic runes, but it's an Easter egg. So I challenge everyone out there to figure out what it says and what it means.
I'll be up all night on my phone. What does it mean? Thanks a lot. All right, Chase, I want to talk to you about episode 2. I want to talk to you about episode 2, Elliot. So this episode had a very dark fairy tale vibe going on, sort of like a Pan's Labyrinth. I mean, there's literally even like a Once Upon a Time in the bookend Disney-style fairy tale book happening in the episode. Can you talk us through the process of tackling the story of a bullied trans teen with the lens of a fairy tale or a dark fairy tale?
Yeah, so I'm so compelled by the Once Upon a Time narrative because it gives us the container of a life story. And I was thinking a lot about, throws to old trans autobiographies, which is one of the only that trans and gender nonconforming people were able to find stories of people who were living lives who might feel similar to their own. And, the dark fairy tale allowed for a kind of split screen approach to the storytelling. We could live upstairs in the school with a kind of rigid, stoic architecture, and we could drop into the basement and switch the aesthetic style and play in different spaces.
Yeah, and even talking about that ocarina, which, I'm like, that's a musical instrument. I've seen it in like Zelda, but like using it as a weapon in the show, that's really interesting. Where did that idea come from?
I will be honest, I read the script and the first thing I thought was, what the hell is that? And the second thing I thought was, Google ocarina, cultural appropriation. And I was like, scroll, like desperately trying to figure out if I was walking into something that I would need to defend. And of course, after doing all of the research, I thought, okay, what do we think about this as instrument, as tool, as way to literalize having a voice or being voiceless, and the role that sound plays, and the choices that Elliot makes to either engage or to silence or to destroy. And so we can really play through his engagement with the object throughout the story.
Yeah, there's a lot of talk about like music versus not having a voice and the silence in the episode. So that makes sense. So let's talk about the importance of casting a trans actor in your hero role.
Yeah. Well, how much time do you have? There are lots of, complex and capacious conversations that we can have about casting, but in this context, it's really uncomplicated. You know, the episode is structured and shot from a trans POV and is entirely reliant upon a kind of synergy and collaboration between, I think, me and James Goldman, our incredible star, to transmasculine identified people who can sit through our COVID masks and have conversations about what it means to play in this space and to tell these stories. And as a director, I'm always thinking, you know, who is the most impacted by the stories that I'm trying to tell? And when you make choices from that place, it is very clear that a young transmasculine person needed to be, you know, the star of our show.
Absolutely. He's wonderful as well. You mentioned the COVID mask. I'd like to talk to both you and Kimani actually about shooting during COVID. At what point did that affect production? Was that something during pre-production when you guys were shooting your episodes, and just like the difficulty of working through and around that? I guess, Chase, if you just want to go for that first, since we're talking already.
Sure. Yeah, I'll pick up on a conversation that Vera and I were having a couple of days ago about, you know, the relationship between storytelling and intimacy and the ways that a mask can inhibit one's ability to connect. And I think directing is so much about eye contact and subtle vocal cue and body language, and there's so much at stake in our physicality and in our proximity. And so being on set in COVID, trying to take care of each other by staying apart was a really interesting challenge. And I really echo Kimani's experience of the team effort, the incredible team effort that is the Two Sentence family, and the ways in which people really stepped up and stepped away in order to take care of each other. But there were some really interesting moments. You know, David Lewis, one of the incredible actors in our episode, at some point said, "Can we figure out a way for you to take your mask off so that I can see what your face looks like, so that I can engage with your direction differently, because I want to know who you are, and I'm struggling to know who you are through these shields." And so we tried to find ways to not cheat, but to meet each other throughout the days.
Yeah, and then Kimani, I know you also directed the last episode of the season, so that's probably, assuming you guys shot sort of in order, probably the furthest into COVID for production. How was that? That episode was all outdoors, but I mean, still there was, I'm sure, a lot of, you know, limitations working like that.
Yeah, no, it was, there was a challenge, but again, with that challenge, I think just film in general and production, you kind of fall back into it because it's your passion, it's what you're passionate about. So there was a little bit of a deterrent, and you know, there was a challenge of directing or communicating. But all in all, it kind of runs smooth once you get the hang of it. And by that time, that was the 10th episode. By that time, everyone was a well-oiled machine, and everyone just, you know, knew what to do, you know, how far to be apart from each other, wash your hands, sanitize, you know. So it kind of ran really smoothly, you know. But it's funny to what Chase was saying. My lead actor, Joel Elliot, on Manifest Destiny, which is the 10th episode, he didn't know what I looked like until I took my mask off for a picture at the end of the shoot.
Wow.
He's like, "Oh, that's what you look like." So it was really quite funny because you kind of forget about the mask after a while. It's just a part of life. So yeah, it never occurred to me that yeah, I've seen their faces because they're acting, but they've never seen my face because I'm always in a mask. So yeah, I just felt that was quite interesting.
Yeah,
And
that's a
I
strange thing to realize. Sorry, Vera.
I just want to jump. No, to piggyback on something that our two directors are talking about, which is the sort of the family, the production family, and the experience. I think it speaks to, well, I will say props to our producers, because we had an entire production during COVID with no COVID cases and no scares.
Wow.
And that is, you know, that is really a true
huge.
testament. Yeah, to their rigor, and, you know, their fastidiousness, and also to the spirit, the sort of collective, collaborative, and communal spirit that they were able to build, which is something that I have always prioritized on this show, where I think process is as important as product, particularly because we're giving opportunities to folks who are often don't find the doors open for them in the television space. And I think a lot of it, I will say, given that this is at, for the Sundance Lodge, this is what happens when you give indie filmmakers the ability to make television, right? So the show has always been, and I've always described it as a hybrid between independent film and, traditional television. And so some of the way that the production operates, of course, functions like, a traditional television model, but the creative, the respect and the space that we, build into for our directors, for our department heads, the sort of creative latitude that's given by having an episodic anthology series that doesn't try to enforce a particular frame or voice or aesthetic across episodes, is because, at least for me, I revere my fellow independent filmmakers and directors and storytellers. And I actually am, as for me, when I'm watching Chase's dailies and I'm watching Kimani's dailies, I'm thinking, oh, that's such a cool way of getting that. And, I wouldn't, if it were me, I wouldn't have done it that way. And it's so exciting to see the point of view. And so, I think it's this like constant back and forth with the independent kind of auteur-driven approach, frankly, to storytelling and some of the requirements of the television model. And we are always negotiating the balance between the two. So for instance, like with Bagman, the original idea came from literally a Japanese urban legend about the girl in the cracks. And that's obviously not what Bagman ended up being, right? And so when I first saw Bagman, the design, I was like, oh, wow, that's amazing, right? And it's just so exciting for me to see people's, creative voices coming through the show within the sort of the architecture of the series itself. And it's the same with the writers, like Melody, where just so many different points of view. The ocarina comes, like all of these elements are reflective of all of the talent of so many folks involved, bringing their personal point of view and their references and their inspirations to the table.
Yeah, I wanted to add to that actually, to Vera's comment. Actually, there's something that was started with the DNA of the show within Vera, in terms of being this sort of unique point of view into the genre. And then it expanded from there into becoming an even more unique animal as being an anthology that has, 10 discrete episodes, which, was daunting to take on, but at the same time, there was a certain continuity throughout. And that continuity is all about the fact that everybody comes at it treating with a lot of sensitivity and care in terms of the heart of the story. There's a collective vision that is really well felt through this production that is really unique. I mean, and it's something that continues to be a way in which we can champion a more radical approach, I think, to the storytelling and a more authentic approach, actually, and that is truthful from all these points of views. And what's great about it is that because we're so well taken care of in the writer's room, but also on the sets with directors who truly understand what needs to be told and what needs to be done and what all the sort of potential third rail issues are. It enables us to be very nimble and to know that, we can cross our fingers and know we're going to land correctly on all these points creatively, because everyone's coming at it from the same sort of rigorous, thoughtful, lived in point of view.
Yeah, for me personally, that's what attracted me to Two Sentence Horror Stories, was like Vera and Stage 13. They really allowed the director freedom, like just to tell the story from their perspective and their voice. And there wasn't like, you weren't being like looked over your shoulder, and they gave you that kind of, I don't know, it was such a pleasure. Like it was such a great feeling to have that. It was like they instilled a confidence in you. It's like, yeah, no, do what you do, have your indie voice, like you're allowed here. And it was like, and for me, that was very special, because you don't get that often. A lot of times, like Vera was saying, you're in constructs, you have to do it this way, there has to be this certain tone, everything has to be similar to the other episodes. And I guess that's with anthology in general, it's just like all different stories kind of put together. So it was just really freeing. So thank you guys.
I wanted to add to that, there is something about being in the writer's room that speaks to all that too, because we were always having each other's back and checking in to make sure that each episode was authentic, that the characters were authentic, that if anyone was even remotely offended by anything, we stopped, we examined it. And it felt like we were always trying to be conscientious while still also digging into the reality of the issues. But there was a really high level of sensitivity, and that comes from, what Vera, gave us, and what we were tasked with doing that with each aspect of each episode. And I love that aspect of that, and working so closely with everyone. And it isn't like we were walking on eggshells. It was actually the opposite. We were really facing whatever it is that needed to really be looked at in each episode. It was great.
Melody, speaking about facing reality with episodes, your episode Quota couldn't be more timely. I'm sure this was written well before any COVID things happens, but even before COVID, outside of COVID world, sort of the subject of warehouse workers and a commentary on society, sort of valuing easy and fast commerce over just human life. Obviously, it's a central theme in your episode Quota. Do you want to talk about that a little bit and sort of the fruition of that idea?
Well, it was interesting because it definitely was the reality catching up with the episode, because I had finished outline and had gone to script before COVID was we understood what COVID was. And in the room, we had thrown around this idea of the workplace violations. And one of the stories that we discussed was this guy who was sick, and he kept going back to the floor, and he died, and nobody knew that he was dead. And I think in that same story, the company had tried to blame the worker for his own death. So that really fueled the story that we wanted to tell. But then as COVID started unfolding, it was really eerie. I was like, this is weird. And then there was a large company that was keeping people working who had COVID, and it was spreading within the company. So it was really like life was imitating art. And I had a lot of trepidation about it at first, but then I thought, no, what we want to address with the core issues haven't changed, and it was an opportunity for us to kind of lean into that. So it was really interesting to see, and very, very eerie. It was scary. It was.
Yeah, it's scary, much like zombies in your story. As far as, picking zombies being sort of the lens with which you tell that story, was there any other sort of horror trope that you thought about, or was it always like, we're zombies working in a warehouse?
I think it was the trope of infection. I think that's that how something can spread, and I think it started off as infection, and then those who are infected act like zombies. But it really was this idea of something that goes. I love this when I see it in a horror film or a show where only some people know what's happening, and around the corner there's something horrific, and it hasn't really caught up with those people who are down the hall. And so that, I think that was a definite, impetus to this.
Yeah. No, this episode really made me think about the fact that, these stories are stories that could easily be like feature-length films, and they've been truncated to, a half-hour episode. Especially with your episode, where I feel like there's a lot of important talk about intersectionality. There's, you touch a little bit on race, gender, socioeconomic status, families, etc. How do you cram all that into just 20-something minutes of TV?
Well, it's kind of a fun challenge. If someone working with those parameters makes you really dig into what works, and I really, we talked in the room about what we don't see very often is what happens between, let's say, a working class Black woman who's a single mother, and maybe who's dark skinned, and then a lighter skinned woman who's maybe working her way through management. Maybe they're both friends, but how do they interact, and where are the power plays, and where are the dynamics in that? And I love the fact that we could play with that nuance, and within the horror story, it was interesting to be able to develop that, and also everything from class to race. To how a woman is treated when she tries to move up the ladder and take responsibility. All of that was, it felt organic to work on it in that story, even though it was short.
So Yeah, I want to make a comment actually, because I think Melody is a really great example of the level of sensitivity and thoughtfulness that goes behind the art of this show. And this is all sort of born out of the DNA of Vera and her vision for this show, and certainly our shared ethos for this show, which is to really bring to life, I think, the complexity of these stories. And I think that particularly as the world has become more complex, and there's more urgency for these stories to be told, I think, in a way that is truthful and with grace and sensitivity, but without pulling punches at the same time. We've really worked hard to ensure that we have curated, I think, a really strong team and to give them the necessary support to be able to do their thing. And we've been very fortunate because so much of the strength of the show is on the shoulders of these creators, both with Vera being the lead creator, but also with Melody and Chase and Kimani and everybody else who have taken ownership, in their part to bring forward the messaging, the storytelling, the genre elements, and to be able to do this all beautifully within a very short, demanding framework. And so this is something which I think is really special about the show.
No, it's great. And just quickly, Melody, because I know you're a Sundance fellow currently, I just want to touch upon that a little bit since this is a Sundance panel. How's that going? And are you finding that you're writing? Are you still doing horror in that fellowship? Are you branching out a bit? Are you finding your work is being influenced by the fellowship or vice versa?
Yeah, definitely. I'm loving it. And I love the fact that it's interesting because Two Sentence Horror Stories gave me this freedom because it's what I like to write. And someone said, yes, go there, dig in and write that way. And so now Sundance is moving me in further along. I'm writing actually a genre pilot that's sci-fi, but deals with a lot of the kinds of issues, multi-ethnic characters, indigenous characters, Black characters that that we were able to develop in Two Sentence Horror Stories and stories around that. So it was really freeing just for my first industry job to be on Two Sentence Horror Stories. I'm really spoiled, and it's really been wonderful working in Sundance, and which also supports and it's a kind of a natural progression for me to be working this way with Sundance as well. It's great.
Well, I want to thank all of the panelists today for joining us, Stage 13 and Warner Brothers for organizing this event, and thank you to everyone at home watching. New episodes of Two Sentence Horror Stories airs on Tuesday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern, 7 Central on the CW network, and they're available the next day on CWTV.com. You can also watch season 1 now on Netflix and the original digital series on Facebook Watch. And before we go, I just want to take a quick special look at a behind-the-scenes clip from episode 2, Elliot.
Elsa, is everything okay?
It's Elliot, remember?
The episode of Elliot is a really special one.
No, honey, you're with the girls.
The episode is about a young trans guy who is in an unaccepting environment.
Oh dear, this is the men's room.
I'm a boy. And how he tries to express himself and let other people know how he feels.
In the process, makes a sort of deal with the devil that ends up taking him to a dark place.
Have you ever seen one of these?
A lot of people don't know a trans person in their life or have never had to encounter what we go through, what all of us go through.
It's time for trans people to tell stories about trans history and trans lives. When these stories are authored by and controlled by those who are most impacted by the storytelling, we enter into a world of new creative possibility.